So those impacts I went over with one of my teachers, Mr. Trembicki, learned a lot about that. But the next thing I did was I met with the chief engineer at Haverford State Hospital. And you don't really need to look at these too close. I think they're very interesting. But what they are the sediment control plans for the Haverford Reserve project. So it shows where your sediment traps are, your sediment basins, your berms that control the flow of water. And then down here are his plans on how to construct each one of these facilities within the reserve. And I went around and I was able to view all of them and take a look at the construction process. And it's very interesting to see what sediment solutions, sediment control programs are being put in local areas. So the first big one is sediment traps. And sediment traps in the basic form are one of two things. The first, as I have up here, it's hard to tell, but that's a top view of a pond. And all the stormwater is directed into this pond. And it sits there. And it's also called a settling basin, where the sediment settles down to the bottom and the fresh water runs into the creek. The next big time that you see a sediment control is in a sediment blanket, which goes over street grades, and they're typically around construction sites. So there's two basic forms of sediment traps that hold back a lot of the debris and dirt that we get into the streams. The next common thing is riprap. Many people know what riprap is out in the country, but in here, not too many people know what it is. There's two forms of riprap. At the beginning, I showed you a picture of a culvert dumping water into the stream. What I hope would be there is either big rocks that would slow down the velocity and catch the debris, or cyclone fencing actually wrapped around, and that will slow down the velocity of the water and catch the debris so it does not erode the banks and not as much sediment gets into the streams. And the last thing I have are some homegrown solutions. So I have a picture of that third sediment trap I was talking about. These are also sediment fences, but one of the biggest things are rain gardens. So you can put these in at home at the exit of a drain spout, and they will catch the water, they'll pull out chemicals, and they'll also slow down the velocity so it doesn't hit the street as fast. The next thing you can do is you can pick up trash. When you're walking around or you're walking your dog, the more trash you pick up, the less it goes into the creek. It just makes sense. And the last thing you can do is, surprisingly or not, use less fertilizer. 39% of the sediment pollution in Pennsylvania is due to poor agricultural practices of fertilizer running off into our streams and into our lakes. And that also causes the algae to bloom, which adds more decomposers to the water and goes through that whole process of killing the fish by removing the oxygen. So these are some basic solutions that I've come up with. That's a picture of a sediment-filled stream. This is a trash rack, which was in place here, and that controls big sediment from getting into the opening that goes into the creek. And then at the gas station, that's just a reminder of if your car leaks oil or it leaks anything else, antifreeze onto the ground, that'll all run off, and that's considered sediment pollution. So I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about sediment pollution, and you understand why I think it's one of our more important problems to consider and to take action against.
Very informative presentation. I really enjoyed it. Boy, I've got lots of questions for you and lots of comments. We're just going to answer questions right now. They're going to ask you to step downstairs. We'll discuss how we're going to grade you, and then invite you back up.
Some questions, then discuss.
Did you catch the article recently in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the relatively limiting, hopefully more common practices using rain barrels?
No, but I've read other articles on rain barrels, and that's one of the solutions. I went out to visit Mr. Trembicki at his house in his apple orchard as a class trip, and one of the things he uses there is rain barrels. We also use them down at our shore house in Maryland. We use rain barrels down there. And I've read a few different articles on them. I've used the water. We actually, down at our shore house, we take the water and we pressurize it. We can use it in the hose, or we can like to wash the car or something like that. I like the method. Once again, it slows down the velocity of the water. It cuts out the amount of water hitting our stormwater systems. It's a good solution.
One of the things you talked about was that dredging is one of the consequences of areas where high amount of sediment settles and that therefore the passageway is shallower for boats. One of the risks of dredging, interestingly, is that it increases metal, all the buried metals that are poisonous then become, right, so it's just yet another.
That and killing all the new bottom life that's taken root on the new layers. It's bad all over. Then they have to dump it somewhere too. That's when we get those sediment islands.
I actually spent my summers at Lake Ontario, so I'm very familiar with the whole freshwater way of life and using freshwater as a way to swim and fish and live. Interestingly, sediment has always been an issue in Lake Ontario because it's the shallowest of the 5 Great Lakes. And we have a lot of algae bloom. Yet the marine economy has completely changed over the last 20 years, and that's because of the presence of seafood mussels.
Yeah. Very incredible.
What we have now is an unbelievably clean, clear water. When you fly in a plane over the top, you can see the bottom of the lake. The problem, you have to swim in shoes, and their fish life is almost non-existent. So we've gone from being hyper-sedimented to virtually nothing, and we have crystal clean water that nothing living. Fascinating stuff. And just to highlight how a personal issue can affect you, the glass pollution we talked about, I had a child actually take to really, I brought it really creep last summer and he was taken to the hospital because the thing was black. It was not visible.
Yeah. The camp I work at in the summer called Huck Finn Student Township, and I've been on that directing staff for the last 6 or 7 years now. And I loved it. I went through it, but we do swim in Darby Creek. And each summer, the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection of Pennsylvania, comes out, and I go with them, and we test the creek. We also test Paracon Creek for basically chloroform bacteria to see if we can swim in and dissolved oxygen content, to see if it's safe to swim in. And luckily, we have had clean creeks in Howardtown for at least the past 20 years, which is what our records show, which is it's very nice to know that. So I know what you mean. We do have fishing hooks, knives that were left there, trash, and especially glass. That's still something we have to consider when we take the kids in the creek.
Any questions?
You've covered many of my questions and comments, so I'm good. Thank you.
So I'll wait for.
Yeah, just step on down and then we're going to talk to you.